Welcome back. Now, South African consumers have got the interest rate relief they were hoping for. The Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee reduced the repo rate by 25 basis points to 8% per annum. For more on what this means for the struggling consumers, we're joined by Saftu's Zwelinzima Vavi and economist Dawie Roodt. Thank you to both of you gentlemen for joining us this evening. I'd like to start with you, Dawie. Your reaction, should South Africans be celebrating?
Well, yes, certainly. Good evening to you. I think we should be celebrating, and we should be celebrating that inflation has been coming down. Inflation, the most recent print on inflation is below 4.5%, 4.4%, and that is excellent news because inflation is a very bad thing. Inflation erodes living standards. Inflation erodes the value of your salary.
Well, it seems that that line is not too clear. Dawie will try and get you reconnected over there. It's seemingly a poor line. But in studio, I do have, of course, Zwelinzima Vavi. Your reaction, I mean, in one of your posts on X, you said the operation has been successful, but the patient has died.
Absolutely. This is just a meaningless move on the part of the Reserve Bank and the Monetary Policy Committee. The 25% or 25 basis point means absolutely very little to a highly indebted working class and middle strata in our country. And indeed, you can see they're beating their drums, beating their chest today, and they think that they have done South Africa a big favor by reducing this repo rate by just 25 basis points. We're now sitting with 8%. Now calculate, they were announcing at the same time that their inflation is now at 4.4%, but their repo rate is now sitting at 8%. But for me and you, the most interesting part is the real interest that we pay in the bank is sitting at 11.5%, because it was 11.75% before today. 11%. You know, 11% means that if you are paying an installment of your car, of your house bond, of everything, you are up to here already. South Africa's working class and middle strata are highly indebted, highly indebted. Let's make an example. Even the FNB, the beneficiaries of this policy, published a study in 2022, and to look at what was the levels of indebtedness of the South Africa's consumer, mainly in the middle strata. And that study said up to 80% of the high-flying doctors spend their income in 5 days. Their disposable income is done in 5 days. And that 30% of that income goes to servicing debt. That was in 2022, before this crazy increase following the Federal Reserve, which have put the repo rate at 8, now the interest rates at 11, me and you that are paying in the bank. You can't do that. So they're celebrating inflation has gone down, but unfortunately they are oblivious to the crisis that is unfolding in the economy. The operation cannot be successful when you can't even confront the rest of the consequences of a policy that is so far removed from the reality of South Africa. The reality of South Africa is that we're now sitting with a 43% unemployment rate. We're sitting with a 49% unemployment rate amongst black people. We're sitting with 70% unemployment rate for our young people below the age of 25. We're sitting with 50% unemployment rate for our youth below the age of 35, which means that the levels of poverty and inequalities continue to increase even in the second quarter of 2022. The GDP only grew by 0.4%. We are hovering around 0.1, 0.4%. How could you be celebrating that? We are opposed to this current monetary policy stance of the government, which then gives the mandate to the Reserve Bank to strangle the economy, to take life out of the economy. No wonder we have lost 50% of our manufacturing capacity between 1994 and to date, because the economy is modeled around the interest of the financiers, the big banks that give us the loans for our cars and so forth, but not for industrialization. It's not meant for people who, 15% backlog, by the way, the last time I checked. There's a 15% backlog of housing in South Africa. You're not talking to those people. Our monetary policy, including this crazy reduction of the exchange controls or doing absolutely nothing with the 300 to 400 billion rands of illicit cash outflows that leaves the shores of our economy to elsewhere. There was no talk about that. There's no talk about the real issues that the poor, the working class and the middle strata is including the manufacturers, are facing in this economy. It's a crazy policy.
And we've been told, you know, over and over again as consumers to tighten our belts. I don't think they can get any tighter. When we do get this kind of reprieve,
the belt is on the bone already.
And this reprieve, you don't see it as any way a bit of a reprieve because we're already on a back foot.
The belt is on the bone. Maybe for the bankers, this is the best season ever. You look at the study that was conducted last year in 2023, it says the combined income of the top executives in the banking sector hit a 457 million rands. Obscene salaries, gross TQ salaries. Unbelievable, no shame at the fact that South Africa has become the most unequal society. These are the cruel people who are holding the economy through the throat. And we can't breathe indeed. And this economy is going to die. In fact, it is dead. They are even oblivious to the social consequences of maintaining this mad inflation targeting that is good for America and Western Europe, but is definitely not good for a country with these massive developmental backlogs. That's why they won't speak about the fact that 84 South Africans die every day violently in the streets. They won't talk about how many women get raped in their homes. They won't talk about the fact that one of the fastest growing economy in South Africa is that of the extorters, the people who mark whether you are selling a magwinya and whatever, because they themselves are the youth that we are losing to boredom as well as to high rates of criminality, of drugs and all of that. They won't speak about that. They have been told by the government, shame on them, focus on inflation targeting of 3 to 6%, and they even have a gall to say, no, that's not hard enough. We want it even lower. We want an inflation targeting of between 2 and 4%, because they're not facing the realities that South Africa's workers and the middle class is facing today.
Also, just speaking about just the bread and butter issues here, earlier you were talking about even doctors being unable to afford, I mean, their salaries being depleted by the first week of getting it as well. And that's a high profession skill, you know, where you do get a decent enough salary. What about the rest of the working class as well? This interest rate cut as well, will it have some sort of an effect on, for instance, your bread basket, your food basket, groceries, or even your installment for your car, as you mentioned earlier, or housing?
Look, 43% or over 12 million South Africans have no relationship whatsoever with the announcement that was made today. None whatsoever, because they are desperately poor. They are unemployed. They are losing hope. We have become the protest capital in the whole world. They are doing service delivery protest, and the media only covers them when they close the highways. Otherwise, their plight is being ignored unless they ban tires and they block the few that are still working on their way going to work. Only then will they see the face of the mayor or of the council. These people don't care about that situation. Now, if you're sitting with 12 million people unemployed, or 43%, or 49% of the people that you told are going to be liberated post-1994 as unemployed, the black women, and in particular the youth and the women, it means that you have lost your soul to neoliberalism. To you, neoliberalism matters more than what you used to call the motive forces of the revolution, the black working class that are sitting in the margins of the economy that still belongs to them and not them as the working class. It's a very, 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 very cold and cruel policy that the government is following, and it is asking the Reserve Bank to implement.
I believe we also have economist Dawie Roodt back on the line. Dawie, I don't know how much you were able to hear from Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi, but he's saying that this is not news to be celebrated because, in fact, you know, when you look at the numbers, it actually doesn't add up. And consumers, South African consumers and the working class ultimately will still remain in debt.
Yeah, I don't know. I hope you can hear me now, or we've sorted out technical stuff for me.
I can hear you a little better now. You can shoot for it.
Can you hear me fine?
Yes. Shoot, Dawie.
Check. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Dawie. You may
me?
continue. Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Okay, let me repeat what I said previously. I hope this time you can hear me properly. Let's say is let's say an example couple of years by bringing inflation to these currently. It has been a process to get employment.
Oh, it's such a pity. Dawie, your line really is terrible indeed. Unfortunately, we cannot continue that conversation with you right now until we fix that. We'll take a short break right now and we'll continue the conversation with Saftu's Zwelinzima Vavi. Welcome back. Well, we continue our conversation with Saftu's Zwelinzima Vavi and economist Dawie Roodt on the reaction to this afternoon's announcement of the interest rate cut by 25 basis points. Now, before the break, we did hear a little bit from Dawie. I'm hoping this line is better. You may continue your point about your reaction to that announcement.
Yes, hello. I hope this works fine. My apologies about that. All right. I think, first of all, we have to congratulate the South African Reserve Bank because we had huge inflationary pressures in South Africa, and I have to say where those inflationary pressures come from. That is crucially important. But the Lesete Kanyaka, despite a lot of pressure from people that do not really understand the economics, he decided to increase interest rates, making life quite difficult for South Africans, and in a process forcing inflation down to where it is currently. Now that inflation is down or much lower, that has created the opportunity for the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates, and if inflation drops even further, then there will be even more room for the Reserve Bank to reduce interest rates. Inflation is a bad thing. Inflation is a horribly bad thing because inflation for a number of reasons. Inflation erodes the value of salaries, it erodes the value of wages. Inflation leads to more poverty. Inflation is especially bad for poor people. We need to get rid of inflation. We need to get inflation as low as we possibly can. Why do we have inflation in South Africa? There are a number of reasons why we have inflation, but the single most important reason why we have inflation is because we do not have a very competitive macroeconomic environment. Let me give you some examples. Some examples are that Eskom gives through these totally ridiculous price increases because nobody can compete with Eskom, because it is quite often, until recently, it was simply illegal to compete with Eskom. That is a so-called administrative price. And there are many other examples of administrative prices. Another example is the local authorities that keep on increasing their taxes, for example, well above the inflation rate, and we, the normal people out there, we simply have to pay. That adds to inflation. Another reason why we have high levels of inflation is because of organized labor. Organized labor in South Africa, because they are very well organized, they can force through very high wage increases, and that also contributes to inflation. While the people that are not properly organized in a labor force, they simply cannot do that. Another very important reason of inflation is because the civil servants, with their ridiculous demands on wage increases. Most recently, they're asking for a 12% increase in wages. The average civil servant is much better remunerated than an average taxpayer. So those are some of the reasons why we have inflation, and inflation leads to the misallocation of resources, and inflation always leads to weak economic growth. It is very painful, the process of getting inflation lower, but it's much better to have relatively high interest rates in the short term than to have very high inflation in the long term. Long-term high levels of inflation will lead to more poverty, and it will lead to more unemployment in the country.
So, Dawie, is this a case of it only gets better before it gets worse, just before it gets better? And if so, with this announcement that was made today, how does that trickle down to the consumer and the worker that is drowning in debt, the consumer that cannot afford to pay electricity, water, or even for food?
Well, the reason why the consumer can't pay for those things is because of a lack of economic growth. But it will certainly filter through to the average consumer in South Africa. If you owe money, your interest will be coming down. You will be paying less on that. Because interest rates are relatively high in South Africa, the rand recently strengthened quite a lot. And that means that the petrol price came down, and the petrol price will come down again next month because of the relevant strength of the currency. Those are all examples of how the average consumer in South Africa can benefit from lower interest rates and lower inflation as well. The alternative will be to follow what Mr. Vavi is suggesting, and that means we cut interest rates, or we start printing money, or we start giving 10 and 12 or 15% increases in wages. That will lead to even higher inflation and even weaker economic growth. We have to understand that the reason why we have weak economic growth in South Africa is not because of the Reserve Bank. Let me repeat that. That is not because of the Reserve Bank. It's because of other factors. It's because we have a very uncompetitive macroeconomic environment. We need to get a more competitive macroeconomic environment, which includes things like competition in electricity and Transnet and all those various sectors that are dominated by the state, where they give us unrealistic price increases, while the rest of us, the private sector, simply cannot keep up with the huge increases in the cost of the state and the high levels of inefficiency in the case of the state.
Mr. Vavi, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to some of the things that economist Dawie Roodt had also had to say, also mentioning that part of the reason is this lack of a macroeconomy, a competitive macroeconomy, but also organized labor.
Well, Dawie is a spokesperson of the moneyed class. He's now speaking and articulating on behalf of the big banks. Quite clearly, that's where his interest lies. I'm sorry to say this, Dawie. But everything that you're saying is being, as we speak, given a round of applause by the heavily earning class, the guys who I was talking about, who have earned a combined 457 million rands in 1 year. They're very happy to hear this. But not me and you, the worker, and somebody who's now drowning in debt, who's being told that we are going to give you a 25 basis point relief. After we have increased, look at this, they have increased the lending rate since they started this chasing following of the Federal Reserve from 7% to 11.75% or 11.75%. That's a staggering 68% increase. Before then, they started this chase of the Reserve Bank you and me, we're spending 7%. We're spending about 6.7% in servicing our debt. We're now at 9.2% spending, and that's a massive 37% increase in just servicing the debt in South Africa. No wonder we've become the most unequal society in the whole world, and no wonder you have the social crisis that I spoke about. You can't have an economy that will survive. He still is calling for more, by the way, Dawie. He says, when he says our macroeconomic policy is not competitive, he's not unpacking that. Let me unpack it for him. He means that the fiscal policies are not tight enough. This so-called fiscal consolidation is not tight enough. You know what that means? They mean as part of creating a conducive environment for investment, we should do even more in decreasing corporate taxes that were sitting at 52% in 1993 at their peak, that have been driven down to 27%. They're still asking for more tax relief. Corporate taxes must go down in the name of being competitive. That's what he means. And secondly, he means the monetary policies that are going to punish the manufacturers. The unemployed are looking at whether this mid-grade 25 basis point will lend to manufacturers going to borrow money tomorrow to build more factories and to build more machines so that they can employ more people. Or the small, medium, macro enterprises, whether they will, as a result of the announcement today, go and borrow money in the banks. They won't, because this is so insignificant and so low that it can only means absolutely symbolism, nothing of significance.
Well, thank you so much for joining us in studio, Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi, and of course to you, Dawie Roodt, as well. Sadly, we have to end this conversation here. Clearly, mixed reaction indeed, depending on which side of the coin that you're looking at. This announcement today by the South African Reserve Bank.